Inside, a baby is languishing. Its weak breaths echo through the corridors, while King David fasts on the cold floor, covered in ashes. Bathsheba, still stained by tears, holds her son's tiny hand and knows each of his sighs is the price of a forbidden desire. But the mystery runs deeper. Why did God seal this romance with death? Does the blame rest solely on David? Or did Bathsheba carry a secret that changed the fate of Israel? And what happened to this woman's heart after her first child was taken from her? Want to discover the truth behind the sin that cost a life and shook an entire kingdom? Stay until the end. The revelation behind Jerusalem's most painful tragedy will challenge everything you've heard about guilt, forgiveness, and redemption. Join us as we explore how Bathsheba, the woman forgotten by the words of men, became an instrument of redemption, promise, and survival. Even when God led her along paths marked by pain and silence. Bathsheba was the daughter of Eliam, one of King David's most loyal warriors, and the granddaughter of Ahithophel, the most respected advisor in all of the kingdom of Israel. Coming from a noble lineage, she was raised among stone columns and rigid traditions, where women learned from an early age that their worth lay in silence, contained beauty, and the family honor they were to represent. From childhood, she knew she would never be heard with the same freedom as men. Her role was to exist with grace, walk discreetly, and maintain peace within the walls of the house. Eliam's house was as solid as his reputation. Situated on one of the elevated parts of Jerusalem, it was close to the corridors of power but shielded from the hustle of the market and the bustle of the palace. It was a home where male voices spoke of wars, counsel, and strategies, while the women prayed, sewed, and waited. Bathsheba learned from her mother to walk in silence, to avoid direct stares, and to save tears for her pillow. She learned from her grandfather to listen more than to speak, and from her father to carry herself with the dignity befitting someone who bears a respected name. It was while still young that she married Uriah the Hittite, a converted foreigner, a brave and honorable warrior. Uriah was known for his integrity, his zeal for God's law, and his unquestionable loyalty to the king. He was a man of few words but firm gestures, and over time, even without grand declarations of love, a serene affection blossomed between them, built on respect and admiration. "I will return soon, Bathsheba," said Uriah one morning as he strapped the sword to his waist. "And I will be here, as I always have been," she replied with a slight smile, holding onto his cloak for a moment longer. He departed for another military campaign under the leadership of Joab, David's general. And she stayed, as she had many times before, taking care of the house, writing letters that might never be read, and fervently praying for her husband to return alive. In those days, Jerusalem vibrated with victories and songs of psalms. King David was loved, his conquests celebrated in every street, but inside Bathsheba's house, silence reigned, a thick silence filled with longing and fear. Every day, she walked to the terrace at dusk, seeking solace in the view of the golden city. And it was on one of those days, when the heat weighed heavily on the stones and the servants gathered rainwater for bathing, that she undressed atop the house, as she always did when the heat made the days difficult to bear. The terrace was private, surrounded by high walls, where she would never have imagined being exposed to prying eyes. Water trickled down her shoulders, and the sound of birds in the distance was the only noise accompanying her. She thought of Uriah. She thought of time. She thought of nothing. It was just another afternoon, like so many others. But on that day, a gaze saw her. At the top of the palace, King David walked alone on the terrace. His eyes wandered over the city, as was his habit. But in that moment, as he looked towards the nearby houses, his eyes stopped. Bathsheba. The sparkle of the water, the outline of her shoulders, the way the sun played with the reflections on her skin. He did not look away. He stood there, motionless, captive to a sudden desire. He called a servant. "Who is that woman?" asked the king in a restrained voice. "It is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, granddaughter of Ahithophel. She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite," replied the servant, after looking in the indicated direction. David nodded slowly. He thought for a moment, and then with a curt gesture commanded, "Bring her to me." The servant hesitated for a brief moment, but obeyed the order without questioning. A king's commands are not to be discussed, especially when given with such silent firmness. Meanwhile, Bathsheba had finished her bath. She was gathering her clothing and combing her still damp hair when she heard movement at the entrance of the house. The maidservants exchanged glances. One of them ran to the door and returned pale. "Men of the king, they want to speak with you." "What do they want?" asked Bathsheba, furrowing her brow. "They say the king has summoned you to the palace. Now." Bathsheba's heart raced. For a moment she remained silent. Her eyes searched for something, perhaps an explanation, perhaps an escape. But there was nothing. It was the king. When a king calls, the people respond, especially when it is a woman, daughter of Eliam, granddaughter of Ahithophel, married to one of the king's own valiant men. She dressed quickly. She chose a simple, neutral cloak and tied her hair back with a discreet ribbon. She descended the stairs of the house with light and firm steps. The maidservants watched her in silence, and the city seemed to breathe more slowly as she passed through the gates. Upon arriving at the palace, she was led through wide and silent corridors. The guards did not speak. The servants did not meet her gaze. When she reached the royal chamber, she saw David waiting, standing with his back to the door, gazing out at the horizon through the open window. "My lord called for me." "Ma," she said in a soft voice, almost inaudible. "Yes," he replied without turning around. "I wanted to see her with my own eyes." There was a pause. David then turned and walked towards her. "They told me your name, but they didn't say you were so beautiful." Bathsheba did not reply. She didn't know how to act or what to expect. She was there against her will. The presence of the king, his eyes on her, everything was strange. Everything was unsettling. "Sit down," said David, pointing to a cushion near him. She obeyed. Her gaze lowered. That night passed like a fog. Sweet words, rehearsed touches, silent promises. She had no way to refuse. He was the king, and her silence was her only defense. When she returned home, she walked slowly through the dark streets. The maidservants were waiting for her, but no one asked. No one dared to speak. She went up to her room and, without saying a word, lay down. The next morning, Jerusalem awoke to the sound of merchants, the smell of fresh bread, and the songs in the temple. But inside Bathsheba's house, time had stopped, and the peace that lived there hid behind the veils of a silence that only women know. A silence laden with fear, shame, and confusion. And it all began with a look. High above the streets and houses of the people, King David walked alone on his terrace, as he often did since he decided not to go to war with his men. The corridors of the palace were silent. The king's hands rested on the carved stone railing. His eyes wandered aimlessly, searching for peace or purpose, the weight of command, the victories, the psalms. Everything felt distant at that moment. There was something restless inside him, something that military conquests could no longer soothe. It was then that his gaze stopped. Below, on the terrace of one of the nearby houses, there was a woman. She was turned away, bent over a stone basin, where the water still reflected the last rays of the day. At first, he did not recognize who she was, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. He watched her delicate movements, the way her hair cascaded down her back, how her skin shimmered in the golden light. David remained there, motionless, as if time had stopped. "Who is she?" he murmured to himself. He called one of the palace servants, who was waiting in the background. "The woman down there," he said, pointing discreetly. "Find out who she is." The servant bowed with a nod and hurried away. The king kept his eyes fixed on the image unfolding before him. Every gesture of the woman seemed to tell him a story he wanted to hear, even without permission. Meanwhile, Bathsheba was finishing her bath. She did not know she was being watched. For her, it was a private moment, a brief relief from the heat of that heavy day. She was alone. The breeze was gentle. The silence felt benign. She slowly descended the internal stairs, still drying her hair with a linen cloth. One of her maidservants was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. "My lady, a messenger from the king is at the door," she said with anxious eyes. Bathsheba frowned. "The king? Why?" "He did not say the reason. He only informed that he wishes to see you at the palace." Bathsheba's heart raced. It was uncommon to be summoned like this, without warning, without context. Even being the granddaughter of Ahithophel, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah, still a direct call from the king was something that made the ground tremble beneath any woman's feet. "Inform that I will prepare myself," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. As the maidservants helped her dress, a dense silence spread through the house. The eyes of the maidens exchanged unspoken questions. Bathsheba's hands trembled slightly, despite her calm appearance. No explanation had been given, but everyone knew that in those times, no woman was called to the palace merely as a matter of protocol. "Take this thicker cloak," said one of the maidservants. "The night may get cold." "Thank you," responded Bathsheba, accepting without looking. She walked up to the gate, where two men were waiting for her. The path to the palace seemed longer than usual. The stones of the street sounded loud under her steps. The sky was already beginning to darken, and the shadows seemed to follow her in silence. At the palace, she was received by another servant who, with a polite gesture, led her inside. "The king is waiting for you," he said. The doors of the chamber opened slowly. David was there, standing facing the window again. "My lord called for me?" Bathsheba said, keeping her eyes down. The king turned slowly. There was something in his face that was not haste nor urgency. It was contained desire, a gaze that crossed words. "Yes," he replied softly. "I wanted to meet you." Bathsheba said nothing. David walked up to her, stopping a few steps away. "You are Eliam's daughter, aren't you?" "Yes, my lord." "And granddaughter of Ahithophel?" "Yes." "And wife of Uriah?" "Yes." "He is on campaign," she said, almost like a whisper. The king nodded as if he already knew. "Uriah is a good man, loyal, strong, one of my best." There was a silence between them. David observed her as one evaluates a precious vase, his voice lowered, becoming more intimate. "When I saw you today, I felt something different, as if the day had stopped for a moment. I haven't felt this in a long time." Bathsheba did not respond. She kept her gaze fixed on a random point on the floor. Her body was there, but her mind shrank with every second. There was no way out. There was no escape. She was before the king, and the king was not just any man. "Come," he said, extending his hand. And she, with no choice, obeyed. That night, nothing that was said could erase what had been done. David crossed a line, and Bathsheba was swept into a story she did not write nor wished for. When she left the palace hours later, the city was asleep, but within her, something had awakened. Something cold, dense, irreversible. She arrived, home unnoticed. She climbed the stairs silently. She took off the cloak with weak hands, and she sat on the edge of the bed with her eyes lost. "Is everything all right, Mum?" asked one of the maids, timidly appearing at the door. "Yes," she replied after a few seconds, "just tired." The maid retreated in silence, and Bathsheba lay down. She stayed there, motionless, staring at the stone ceiling as if it were about to collapse. She tried not to think. She tried not to remember. But his touch, his gaze, his voice, everything came back, and she didn't know. But from that moment on, she would never have peace again. It was not just the suffocating heat rising from the hot stones, nor the distant murmur of the guards changing shifts. It was something deeper, more silent, an invisible tension that spread like an overly strong perfume. In Eliam's house, the atmosphere was one of unrest. Bathsheba was alone in her room, sitting in front of the bronze mirror. Her hands remained still on her knees, but inside her, everything was swirling. Since returning from the palace, no word had come out lightly. The maids tried to feign normalcy, but she knew their eyes were asking what their lips could not, and she herself couldn't name what had happened. It was then that the sound of firm knocks echoed through the front door. One of the servants opened. "It's the messenger of King David," he announced in a low voice, almost reverently. Bathsheba's heart froze. Her body did not move, but her veins pulsed more strongly. "The king wishes to see you again," said the messenger, keeping. His head bowed. The maidens stopped. Time for a moment stood still with them. None of them dared to take a deep breath. Bathsheba rose slowly. She didn't ask why, nor did she try to refuse. She knew that a king's desire was an order dressed in courtesy. "I will prepare my garments," she said in a low voice, almost like a lament. In the back chamber, the oldest maid approached with a light linen dress. "This one, my lady?" she asked. "No, the dark one. The one with long sleeves," Bathsheba replied. "Today, I don't want my body to speak for me." The path to the palace seemed longer than before, even though the steps were the same. The narrow streets felt like they were squeezing her lungs, and the echoes of the soldiers' footsteps at the corners sounded louder than they should have. When she arrived at the royal gates, she took a deep breath. There was something in her that wished to turn and run to forget, but that would be a greater scandal than silence. The doors opened. The same servant from the last time received her with a nod. The corridors seemed darker, the tapestries heavier, the columns colder. Each step inside that place was like walking down a path from which there is no return. "The king is waiting for you," said the servant, opening the chamber doors. David was there again, but this time there were no sweet words ready. He stood with his hands behind his back, looking out the window. The king's body was at rest, but his eyes burned with something that could not be appeased. "Bathsheba," he said without turning, "how good that you came." She remained silent. "I have not had peace since we last met," he continued. "Your face visited me in dreams. Your scent seemed to be in every corridor. I missed your voice, even without having really heard it." She lowered her eyes. "I do not understand, my lord. I am a married woman." David turned, approaching with firm steps. "I am king," he replied, without arrogance, just with the certainty of someone used to not being denied. "And you are more than a married woman. You are the daughter of a warrior, the granddaughter of a wise man, and now you are here before me." She swallowed hard. "It was not my choice to come. I was summoned." David moved even closer. He was so near that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "You don't need to be afraid," he said, his voice lower, almost a whisper. "I don't want to force you into anything, but what I feel is greater than I can hide." Bathsheba remained still. The words found no way. Her body, betrayed by fear and confusion, stayed where it was. Her heart beat strongly, but her soul shrank. "What right do I have to refuse a king?" she murmured, her eyes fixed on the ground. David extended his hand and touched her face. "It's not about rights, but about moments. There are moments we cannot lose, moments that change everything." She closed her eyes for a moment. Inside herself she felt like she was sinking into something she could not name. Was it desire? Was it fear? Was it submission? It was everything at once in a mix that hurt. That night he took her for himself, with sweetness, with words. But the gesture, even wrapped in seduction, was a gesture of power. And Bathsheba, without the strength to fight against the destiny pulling her, let herself be carried away. Later, when the corridors were silent, she was led back. She left the palace as she had entered, head down, with restrained steps, but inside her something had died. The woman who had bathed on the terrace that afternoon no longer existed. The streets were empty. The city slept. But she walked as if carrying a weight that did not belong to her body. When she crossed the gate of her house, the servants approached in silence. No words were spoken. In the room she sat on the edge of the bed, untying the straps of her dress with cold hands. "Ma'am, would you like some tea?" asked one of the maids. "No, I desire what I cannot have," she replied without looking. The maid stepped back and extinguished the lamp. The darkness enveloped the room, and Bathsheba lay down, her eyes open, staring at the stone ceiling. Inside her, questions echoed. What have I done? What did he do to me? What will I do now? And when the palace doors closed behind her that night, something inside Bathsheba was left behind, something that would never return. Before we continue, we ask for your support. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to bless us and continue sharing these profound biblical stories with more hearts. Now we continue with Bathsheba's journey of faith, tears, and resurrection. The tall columns of the chamber did not witness words of love, only silent gestures, and a weight that settled, layer by layer, upon a woman's soul. Bathsheba did not sleep that night. Although her body lay still, her eyes remained open, fixed, On the golden ceiling of the room, the sheets carried the king's scent, and with it a bittersweet odor of confusion, power, and guilt. Her breathing was slow, like one who struggles not to shatter into pieces. In the dimness, thoughts came like arrows. I should have spoken more, should have said no, should have run away. But how to flee from a king? How to raise one's voice against one who decides who lives and who dies? How to explain to the world that it was not consent, but an obedience imposed by position and fear? In the next room, King David slept in peace. Bathsheba slowly rose, wrapped herself in her mantle, and walked to the stone balcony. The moon still shone over the rooftops, and the city slept, unaware of what had just happened, in silence. She held tightly to the railing and finally let a few tears flow. But even the tears did not come freely. She felt that even her crying needed to be contained, domesticated. David's words still echoed in her mind. You are special. There is something in you that the whole world does not see, but I see it. She squinted her eyes, trying to erase the memory. Those words did not comfort her, they hurt. She remembered her father's voice, Eliam, who once told her, "A woman's honor is not in the eyes of others, but in the truth she carries within herself." But what happens when that truth is crushed? By the desire of a king. At dawn, one of the servants gently knocked on the door. "Do you wish for something for breakfast?" "Just water," she replied in a hoarse voice. She dressed in silence, arranged her hair with her own hands, and waited for the carriage to take her home. The corridors of the palace seemed colder in the morning light. The marble beneath her feet seemed to accuse her. Each step echoed as if the walls were listening. As she walked through the palace gates, Bathsheba was no longer the same woman who had entered days before. On the street, people walked at their usual pace. Vendors were opening their stalls, children ran over the stones, women carried jars of water, and she, dressed in her dark cloak, walked among them with her eyes fixed ahead, trying not to be noticed, even knowing that the world had changed forever. "Ma'am, the bath is ready," a servant said as she saw her enter the house. Later she replied, "Today I just want to rest." She locked herself in her room. She sat before the mirror and faced her own image. Her face was the same, her eyes too. But there was something in her features, a weariness that hadn't been there before. She touched her own lips and felt shame. Shame for something she had not chosen, but that was now her burden. In the afternoon, her mother visited her. "You look pale, my daughter," the woman said, watching her with attentive eyes. "Has something happened?" Bathsheba looked away. "Just a long night," she replied. "Nothing for you to worry about." The mother nodded but did not seem convinced. Still, she did not insist, because in the world of the women of Jerusalem, too many questions could mean danger. That night, Bathsheba wrote a letter to Uriah, a simple parchment with a few words, no mention of what had happened, just a "I'm waiting for you" written with trembling hands. She knew he might never know, or maybe he knew everything. The king did not need to explain himself. The king was law, and she was just a woman. In the days that followed, she tried to keep herself busy. She gathered fabrics, took care of the herbs in the garden, instructed the maids. But something in her had silenced in a deeper way. She no longer smiled as before. She no longer sang in the late afternoons. And at night she went to bed early, but sleep evaded her. The maidens whispered among themselves. Some wondered why the lady of the house was so quiet. Others, more experienced, merely sighed. There was a type of silence that all women recognized, and that one, they knew, was a silence of someone who carried more than she could say. "Do you want me to read the Psalms?" asked a maid. "No," replied Bathsheba. "Today the words hurt me." One day, while watering the plants in the courtyard, she heard her name being whispered by two women passing by on the street. "They say she was called to the palace," said one, "and came back different," added the other. Bathsheba did not turn around. She continued to water the plants as if she hadn't heard. But inside the pain grew. The world began to see in her a mark that was not hers, a judgment she did not deserve, a guilt that did not belong to her. That same night, she knelt before God. For the first time in days, she opened her lips to pray. "Lord, you see what the eyes cannot see. You know the corners where the mouth cannot reach. You know it wasn't me who chose. But why does the weight fall upon me?" The sky did not answer, and she understood with a chill in her soul that a woman's life in Israel was not made up only of honor or shame. It was made of imposed silences and inherited guilt, and in the heart of Bathsheba, the bitter certainty grew. The world did not want to know the truth. It would only see what was before its eyes, but the eyes of the world would never understand the difference. Bathsheba lived as if she were walking on invisible shards. Each breath was measured, each step heavy, each gaze averted. She barely ate, barely spoke. The maids began to notice. Her eyes were deeper, her hands trembled while sewing, and fatigue seemed to grow over her shoulders like a veil of iron. At first, she thought it was just the trauma, the body trying to forget, the soul still in shock. But then came the first signs, the delay, the morning sickness, the bitter taste in her mouth, and finally, the certainty that could no longer be ignored. That morning, when she fell to her knees, beside the wash basin, Bathsheba knew. Her heart raced. Her hands instinctively went to her belly. The truth, the one she still didn't want to name, was now there, alive, growing inside her. A secret that could not be hidden for long. She remained, kneeling for a long time, breathing heavily. The cold stone floor pressed against her knees, but she couldn't get up. It was as if life had stopped, as if the world had changed color. This was not just a pregnancy, it was a sentence. "Ma'am," called a servant from the other side of the door. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Bathsheba replied, her voice choked. "I need a moment alone." She slowly stood up, washed her face, but her eyes remained red. She dressed calmly, with slow, automatic gestures, and then she sat down to write. The papyrus before her seemed like an abyss. The words weighed more than her hands could hold. She picked up the inkwell, took a deep breath, and wrote just 3 words, "I'm pregnant." She carefully folded the parchment as one folds a burden. She called one of her trusted maids, looked her in the eyes, and spoke firmly, "Take this to the palace, in hand, only to the king." The maid obeyed without questioning. She left in haste without looking back. Bathsheba remained there seated, her eyes fixed on the closed door, feeling time drag like fine sand slipping through her fingers. The wait for an answer was worse than fear. The thought of Uriah came like a blade. Her husband, the man who had gone to war without knowing what was about to happen to his own house. The man who would never deserve betrayal, but who would now have to bear the consequences of an act she didn't choose. "Lord," Bathsheba whispered, her eyes raised to the ceiling. "Why did you make me carry what I did not ask for?" Why do you allow the body to suffer for the choices of others? Hours passed. The daylight changed tone, and nothing returned. No answer. No sound from the street seemed to bring comfort. She began to imagine the worst. And if David denies it, and if he blames me, and if I am taken to the square, judged as an adulteress, even though the king is the cause, will it be me who gets stoned? Her womb was still small, but inside it, there was already an earthquake. A life was forming, and with it a scandal was growing. At night, she couldn't eat. The food tasted like ashes. The words of the servants seemed to come from far away. She slept little, wrapped in heavy sheets, as if sleep itself refused to visit her. The next day the answer came, but not in words. A new messenger, older, came on behalf of the king. The king wishes to speak with Uriah, the man said, avoiding Bathsheba's gaze. The woman felt her stomach churn. Uriah is on the battlefield. Why would the king call for him now? I am just following orders, the man replied, stepping back. She stood there alone in the room, gripping the back of the chair, as if the furniture could prevent her world from collapsing. David was scheming. He couldn't let the pregnancy come to light. He would call Uriah, he would try to manipulate the situation. He would pretend the child was his husband's, all to avoid scandal. But Bathsheba knew Uriah was not an ordinary man. He was upright. He was loyal. He was determined by the truth. That same afternoon, she discreetly left and went to the house of Ahithophel, her grandfather. She wanted to see his eyes. She wanted to know if, by some miracle, he knew what to do. But when she saw him sitting on the porch, reading silently, she felt there was no refuge there either. "Are you okay, my granddaughter?" he asked without looking up from the scroll. "Everything's fine, Grandpa," she lied, sitting on the stairs with her eyes downcast. "I just feel a little lost." Ahithophel closed the scroll and looked at her attentively. "There are things we cannot avoid, but there are truths that, if hidden for too long, kill more than swords do." Bathsheba felt her eyes well up with tears, but she did not respond. She couldn't. On her way back home, she locked herself in her room, lay on her side, and held her belly with both hands. It was still small, no visible mark, but inside her was a soul, a life that no one could know existed. "You didn't ask to come, little one," she whispered, "and I didn't ask to carry you, but you are here, and I will protect you as best I can." Deep down, she knew that the protection would not come easily. The secret that was growing inside her was also a threat. The sin was not hers, but the judgment of the people would not care about details. In the eyes of the crowd, a swollen belly and an absent husband were enough to point the finger, and Bathsheba, alone in the darkness of her room, felt that she carried more than a child. She carried a secret that could destroy her. The sound of the horses' hooves and the clattering of hooves on the stones of Jerusalem announced Uriah's arrival even before his name was mentioned. Bathsheba heard it from the balcony, her heart racing. The king had done the unthinkable. He had called Uriah back from the war abruptly, under the pretext of wanting news from the front. But Bathsheba knew that was not concern, it was despair. She didn't know what to do, nor what to say, how to explain to her husband, a just and faithful man, what she could not even understand, how to confess a sin she did not commit, how to reveal that she carried in her womb a child that was not his. Fear tightened her throat, and no matter how hard she tried to imagine a dignified outcome, all paths led to pain. When Uriah entered through the door, Bathsheba felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. "Bathsheba," he said with a discreet smile, his face covered in road dust, his eyes tired but alive. "I didn't expect to return like this so suddenly," she forced a smile. "Neither do I, my lord, but I am happy to see you." Uriah approached and touched her shoulder with the palm of his hand. It was a simple gesture, but full of meaning. There was affection, respect, and a warmth that Bathsheba had almost forgotten. "The king summoned me to the palace," he said, untying the straps of his sandals. "He sent me back urgently. He wanted to know how the troops were, how the siege of Rabbah was progressing. I found it strange, but I obeyed." She watched him in silence. His face, so familiar, now hurt her eyes. She thought about how loyal, honest, and incapable of betrayal, lying or hiding anything he was, and that made everything even worse. That night, Bathsheba prepared dinner with her own hands. She sat at the table with Uriah. She listened about the war, the comrades, the cold of the tents, and the songs that the soldiers sang around the fire. Uriah spoke with a sparkle in his eyes, and she, with tears hidden inside. When the meal was over, she arranged the bed. She was ready to tell, to confess, to explain everything. But before she could open her mouth, he stood up. "I will not sleep at home tonight," he said firmly. Bathsheba stood up, surprised. "But why?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "While my brothers in arms sleep under the open sky, at the risk of arrows and the cold, I cannot lie down in my bed, eat well, and enjoy the comfort of my home. That would be unjust. It would be unworthy." She felt her body grow cold. "But the king allowed you to come and rest. I respect the king," Uriah said, "but my conscience is above my comfort. I will sleep among the guards, in the palace courtyard." Bathsheba did not insist. She merely watched him leave with determined steps. His integrity was a blessing, and that night a curse. David counted on Uriah to return, lie with her, and thus no one would doubt the paternity of the child. But Uriah did not play the king's game. He played the game of truth. And for that reason, he became a problem. The next day, Uriah returned to the palace. David welcomed him with smiles and sweet words. "Did you rest well, Uriah?" "I slept among the servants of the royal household," he replied. "I thought it was better." David pursed his lips, pretending to be astonished. "But why? You were in your own house, with your wife." Uriah shrugged his shoulders. "While the ark and the army of Israel camp in the open air, how could I enjoy the warmth of my wife? It would be to betray the memory of those who fell yesterday and the hope of those who will fall tomorrow." The king fell silent, and for the first time in a long time he felt without answers. That very night David sent for Uriah to dine with him. He served him wine, a lot of wine. He filled his cup again and again, trying to get him drunk. He laughed loudly, told stories, praised his courage. But even inebriated, Uriah remained steadfast. "Go to your house, man," said the king with false cheerfulness. "Take your wife in your arms, sleep in your bed." But Uriah went out and once again lay down among the servants, under the stars. And Bathsheba, on the other side of the city, awaited him in agony, with her heart crushed by a future she could no longer control. He didn't come, She said to one of the servants, her voice faltering, "Perhaps he is tired, my lady." "No. He is being faithful. Faithful to what he believes. Faithful to the king who no longer deserves his loyalty." The following morning, David, furious and cornered, made a grim decision. He wrote a letter, sealed it with the royal seal, and ironically entrusted the very letter to Uriah. "Deliver this to Joab," he said. "It is an important order. You must go immediately." Uriah bowed respectfully. He placed the scroll inside, his cloak over his chest. He mounted his horse and left, unaware that he was carrying his own death sentence. Bathsheba learned of the departure too late. When she realized that Uriah had returned to the battlefield, something inside her broke. She ran up to her room, knelt by the bed, clutched her belly with both hands, wept silently, and pleaded with God, "Don't let him die. Not because of me." But the heavens did not respond. And while she fell apart in prayer, Uriah slept among the guards, and the king plotted his death. But in Bathsheba's house, time seemed frozen. There was a thick silence in the corridors, as if the very stone held a secret it did not want to reveal. Bathsheba awoke with a sense that something was wrong. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a sight. It was an absence. A strange emptiness in the air. She scanned the house and noticed that Uriah's sandals were no longer by the door. The place where he left his cloak was empty. His scent was already starting to fade from the fabrics. The youngest maidservant, upon seeing her descend the stairs, averted her gaze. "Where is my husband?" she asked, her voice still choked with sleep. "He left at daybreak, ma'am," replied the maid hesitantly. "The king sent him back to the field. He carried a sealed scroll." "Didn't he say goodbye?" Bathsheba asked, in a whisper almost inaudible. The maid shook her head silently. She turned away without saying anything and returned to her room. She sat at the edge of the bed, her body rigid, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt a slight twinge in her belly, a vivid reminder of the truth growing within her, silent like everything else. She had hoped that that night would be her chance to talk, to tell, to try. But he slept among the servants, as always, faithful to the end. And now, he had left without looking back. What letter was he carrying? He asked aloud, without waiting for a response. Bathsheba spent the rest of the day in silence. The maidservant spoke softly, moving with light steps, as if sensing that something had been broken. The garden received no care. The loom remained untouched. The tea leaves dried on the tray. There was a weight in the air, a shadow over the house. In the palace, David walked back and forth in his chamber. His face was tense, his expression grave. He called for a servant. "Has he already left?" he asked. "Yes, my lord, before sunrise. With the letter, yes." Kept close to his chest. The king nodded slowly and dismissed the servant. He turned to the window. He watched the horizon as if he were expecting a storm. Inside himself, a conflict was eating away at him. He had written the order with his own hands. He had instructed Joab coldly, "Put Uriah at the forefront of the fiercest battle, then retreat and let him fall." The sentence was drawn, sealed with the royal ring, sent by innocent hands, and Uriah, faithful until the last moment, carried his death in his heart without knowing. Bathsheba didn't know, but she felt it. The restlessness growing in her chest was unusual. It was as if the womb she carried began to alert her that something greater was stirring beyond the walls of the house. She walked to the yard, looked up at the sky. No answer. That night she couldn't sleep. She got up several times, lit a lamp, walked down the hallway. She touched Uriah's belongings, the bow hanging on the wall, the cloth he wore over his shoulders. Each detail was a memory, a whisper that he existed, that even without knowing he had been used. "Uriah," she said to the void, "come back to me." But Uriah would not return. On the battlefield, the soldiers prepared for the advance. Joab received the letter with the royal orders and read in silence. No expression on his face, no comments. He simply closed the scroll, tore it into pieces, and burned them. Then he sent for Uriah. "Tomorrow you will lead the charge at the main gate of the enemy city," said the commander. "Yes, my lord," replied Uriah firmly. "It will be a difficult position, exposed, but we trust you. I will die if necessary." Joab did not respond. He merely nodded and dismissed him. The next morning, when the trumpet sounded, Uriah marched at the front. Dust rose beneath the feet of the warriors, and the heat made the air almost unbreathable. Uriah did not hesitate. He advanced bravely, sword in hand, heart steady. But when the wall spit out its arrows, and the men around him began to retreat, he stood his ground. No one came back for him, and Uriah fell in Jerusalem. Bathsheba was tending the garden when the youngest flower was torn in half by the wind. The vase fell and shattered. The sound of the shattering made her body tremble. "My lady, is everything all right?" asked a servant. "It was just the wind," she replied, even though she knew it wasn't. That night she lay down early, her head on the pillow, her eyes in the dark, her soul lost. Why didn't he say goodbye? She asked herself, her voice choked with emotion. And unknowingly, she shed her last tear before the news arrived, and I didn't know. That kiss would be the last. Urias, as always, was at the front lines. His face was firm, his eyes alert, no trace of fear, no doubt. Joab watched from a distance. There was tension in his expression, but no surprise. He knew what had been ordered. He knew what was supposed to happen that day. The king had been clear, and though his heart was heavy, Joab was loyal to the throne. Advance. Without reinforcements, he commanded quietly to the captains by his side. The assault began. Urias ran among the first. Dust was kicked up under the soldiers' feet. Arrows began to fly. The city walls spewed fire and stone. The war cries blended with the sound of metal against shield. And then, in the chaos of battle, something happened. One arrow, precise, direct. It penetrated Urias's chest like a final sentence. He fell to his knees. No shout, no scandal. He just fell, like a man who fulfilled his mission to the end. The companions around him tried to react, but the order to retreat had already been given. It was too late. Urias collapsed alone, his face in the red, blood-soaked earth, his eyes open to a sky that did not respond. On that same day, a messenger set off towards Jerusalem. He carried with him a report of the battle, and amid the formal and tactical words, a phrase weighted like a dagger ready to wound. Urias the Hittite is dead. In the holy city, the sun shone high when the news reached the palace. David received the messenger calmly. He listened to the report without interruption. When the final phrase was uttered, he merely nodded. "Tell Joab not to be saddened," he replied. "The sword devours both this and that. Continue the siege. May victory come soon." The tone was cold, practical, as if speaking about the fall of yet another among many. But it wasn't just another. It was Uriah, the loyal, the just, the innocent. In Bathsheba's house the day was overly quiet. The maids worked in silence. There was a foreboding in the air. The windows were open, but the wind did not come in. And then the knocks at the door. She herself went down to attend. When she saw the king's messenger, she knew. Even before he spoke, she knew. His eyes said everything. His face marked by the dust of the road, his trembling mouth, the posture of one carrying a sentence. "Lady," he said, lowering his head, "the king regrets to inform that Uriah has fallen in battle." She did not respond. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She simply stood still. "He died fighting with honor," the messenger added, searching for words that might soften the blow, but nothing could soften. Bathsheba closed the door without saying anything more. She went up the stairs slowly, as if each step were a weight. She reached the room, locked the door, and only then fell to her knees. She did not cry out loud. She did not tear her clothes. She simply bowed, her hands pressing against her abdomen, her breath hitched. The morning came silently, like a tsunami that drowns without a sound. The servants understood. They dressed in mourning. The house darkened, and the following days were enveloped in veils and silence. For 7 days, Bathsheba cried alone. Not for the scandal, not for the shame. She cried for Uriah, for the man who loved her, honored her, protected her, and who now lay under a soil she would never touch. She cried for not having said goodbye, for having hidden from him the secret she carried in her womb. She cried, knowing that, even without knowing, he had died faithful to a king who betrayed him in silence. "He trusted," she said to one of the servants, her eyes swollen. "He trusted and died for it." The servant said nothing. How could she? On the 8th day, new messengers arrived. King David sent word that he wished to take Bathsheba as his wife. It was the final act of cover-up. If she were to become his wife, the child could be born without scandal. It would be accepted. It would be raised as legitimate. The sin would be disguised by the crown. Bathsheba listened to the proposal in silence. It was no surprise, it was inevitable. The mourning was still fresh, but now it would be replaced by a new identity, that of the king's wife. A position that so many women dreamed of, but for her it came stained with blood. "Prepare my clothes," she said in a low voice. "I will go to the palace." Upon entering the royal chambers for the 3rd time, Bathsheba was no longer the young woman who bathed in peace, nor the confused woman of the imposed night. Now she was a widow, a mother, and a prisoner of a secret that would change the course of the kingdom. David received her with a restrained smile. There was solemnity in the air, but no visible regret. His eyes searched hers, but she looked away. She sat down in front of him and waited for the words. "I mourn the death of Uriah," said the king. "He was a good man." She did not respond. "And I want to take you as my wife, to honor you, and to protect the child you carry." He spoke as if he were doing justice, as if it were an act of kindness. But inside her, Bathsheba screamed. She nodded her head. She accepted, not out of love, not out of desire, but because the world she lived in did not allow her to refuse. That night, she dressed as a bride, but in her heart there was only mourning. The dress was white, but inside her everything was dark, and even when the ceremony ended and the psalms were sung in the palace halls, the sky remained silent. But God had seen, and the sky would not remain silent for long. Jerusalem murmured in the corners. Women whispered by the fountains. Men exchanged glances in the markets. The king, a widower by choice and lord of many victories, was now hastily joining a woman pregnant with a child that time would reveal. But none dared speak loudly, because it was David, and because Bathsheba now belonged to the court. The palace was prepared for the ceremony. Tapestries were changed, perfumes spread through the corridors, musicians hired for a brief and contained song. But inside the new bride, there was no room for celebration. Bathsheba entered the royal gates for the third time. But unlike the previous ones, this time there was no fear. There was resignation. Her soul no longer wept in despair. She cried in silence, in such profound silence that she no longer made noise inside. "The king is waiting," said one of the palace women, adjusting the veil over her head. "So be it," replied Bathsheba, not looking at the mirror. Upon entering the royal chamber, she saw David dressed in a fine linen tunic, his hair neatly styled, his expression calm. He walked up to her and solemnly took her hands. "From this day on, you are my wife," he said. "This palace will be your home. This people will honor you as queen, and your son will be like my son." She nodded. Just that. No words, no tears, no protest. Her soul was chained in a protocol that muffled any pain. It was the silence of power. The crown now touched her, but not as honor, rather as sentence. During the brief ceremony, the chants were soft. The eyes of those present were restrained. Everyone knew. No one spoke. It was the truth, suffocated by the weight of royalty. A secret now draped in a scarlet cloak. Later, already in the royal chambers, the maidservants helped her undress. Their hands were cold, their eyes empty. "May God grant you children," one of them said, with a timid attempt at consolation. "He has already granted me one," replied Bathsheba, touching her belly. "But I still don't know if the world will accept him." David visited her that night. He touched her shoulders. He spoke soft words. He tried to make the weight of the scandal be replaced by the hope of a new phase. But she listened as one listens, to the wind in the trees, distant, on another shore of the soul. "Trust me," said the king, placing his hand over hers. "Everything will be all right." But what he did not know, or did not want to see, was that she needed more than just security. She needed justice, and that he could not give her. The days that followed were even quieter. The palace had its rituals, and Bathsheba followed them with precision. She sat at the table with other women of the court. She walked discreetly through the gardens. She learned to smile without showing her teeth, to wave without getting too close. She was the king's wife, but inside, she was still the widow of a man who died faithful. At night, she sat alone by the window. She looked at the stars, and in her thoughts she conversed with the husband she could not bury, Urias. "If you see me, forgive me. I was not the one who killed you, but I was used to destroy you. No one listened to your prayers. No one asked how you felt, not even David. The palace was a place where feelings were disguised by protocols, where tears had no space between marble columns. And the child grew. Her womb, once silent, now showed signs of the life she carried. The morning pains, the weight in her feet, the change in her breathing rhythm. Each beat of her heart seemed to warn her that something was approaching. Not just the birth, but the consequence. "Madam," said one of the servants one day. "The people are starting to refer to the child as the prince." Bathsheba looked at her with a neutral expression. "He hasn't been born yet. He doesn't belong to anyone yet. He is just mine." But she knew that soon he would belong to everyone. The child would be seen as a symbol of continuity, success, redemption. But she knew that this child was the result of something that should never have happened. In royal meetings, David spoke with the advisors, led the kingdom, as if everything was under control. But Bathsheba saw something in his eyes, a shadow, a hidden restlessness amid orders and decrees, perhaps guilt, perhaps just fear. "Everything will be different now," he said. "God is still with us." But she knew. Something had changed in the sky. The silence of God, which had once been comfort, was now an omen. And so the womb grew, the rumors quieted, the protocol followed. But inside Bathsheba, everything was at war. The mourning still lived within her, muffled by veils and crowns. And the child she carried, though innocent, was also a living memory of what had happened. That night, as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she touched her belly and whispered, "You are not to blame, but the world will not understand. That neither the throne nor the people nor She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and knew. The throne was now her prison, and her womb a sentence. The palace corridors were silent that morning. There was an unusual stillness, as if the very air knew that something important was about to happen. Bathsheba woke up early. The first rays of the sun had barely touched the linen curtains when she heard the quick footsteps of the servants, the discreet whispers of the guards, and finally the sacred name being mentioned in a low voice. "Nathan, God's prophet, is at the gates." That simple phrase made Bathsheba's heart race. The name Nathan carried weight. He was not just an advisor. He was the voice of God, the same one who had anointed kings, confronted empires, and declared truths that no man dared to say. If he came without an invitation, it was because he came with a divine mission. She quietly left her chambers and positioned herself behind one of the large columns in the hall, where she could listen without being seen. Her body trembled, but not from fear. She trembled with anticipation. She knew God's silence was coming to an end. The prophet's entrance was firm. His eyes did not waver. His face, already marked by time and holiness, reflected the gentle wrath of the heavens. David, seated on the throne, stood up to greet him with the cordial expression he always had. "Nathan," he said with a half-smile, "what a joy to see you." "I have come with a word from the Lord," replied the prophet without adornments. The king nodded and signaled for him to continue. Bathsheba, in the distance, held her breath. "There were two men in a certain city," Nathan began. "One was rich, and the other poor. The rich one had many sheep and oxen. The poor man had only a little lamb that he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It ate from his plate, drank from his cup, and slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him." David listened attentively, his eyebrows furrowed. "One day," the prophet continued, "the rich man received a visitor. But instead of taking one of his many sheep from his flock, he took the only sheep the poor man had. He killed it. He prepared it to feed the traveler." A silence fell over the hall. David stood up, filled with indignation. "That man deserves death," he exclaimed. "For the lack of compassion he shall pay 4 times as much. How could he do something so cruel?" Nathan lifted his eyes. He stepped forward, and with a firm voice, as if the heavens were speaking through him, he declared, "You are that man." Time stood still. Bathsheba, hidden behind the column, felt a shiver run through her body. David remained standing, but the blood seemed to drain from his face. The words echoed like thunder in the silence of the room. "Thus says the Lord, God of Israel," Nathan continued. "I anointed you king over Israel. I delivered you from the hands of Saul. I gave you the house of your Lord and put the kingdom into your hands, and if that were too little, I would give you even more. But you have despised the word of the Lord and done what is evil in his sight. You killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You took his wife as your own, and you killed him by the hands of the Ammonites." The ground seemed to open beneath David's feet. No sound, no words. The silence was complete. Even the servants seemed frozen, and Nathan continued, "Therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised the Lord and taken Uriah's wife. Thus says the Lord, Behold, I will bring evil upon you from your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to another. You did it secretly, but I will do this before all Israel under the sun." David fell to his knees. "I have sinned against the Lord," he murmured with a trembling voice. "The Lord has forgiven your sin," Nathan replied. "You shall not die, but the child born to you shall die." In that phrase, Bathsheba felt the world spin. Her eyes widened. The belly, which was growing silently, seemed to shrink within. Her hands instinctively touched her belly as if they could protect the child from divine judgment. She could not scream. Not there. Not in front of the king, the prophet, the servants. But her heart screamed. It screamed loudly, as if each heartbeat said, "Not the baby, not him. He is not to blame." The prophet turned and left with the same firmness with which he entered, and the hall fell silent. David, still kneeling, remained there for long minutes, his eyes fixed on the ground. The advisors discreetly moved away, and Bathsheba returned to her chambers like one coming back from a battlefield without having fought. She locked herself in, sat on the floor and cried, "He is going to die." She repeated, "He is going to die for something I did not choose, for something I did not do." A servant tried to approach. "Mom, go away. Leave me alone." The woman hesitated, but obeyed. The room remained dark for the rest of the day. Bathsheba did not eat, did not speak, did not move her lips for any more prayers. The prophecy had been cast. God's justice at last had risen like a sword over the palace, but the price of that justice was yet to be revealed. Since the prophet Nathan left through the palace gates, no words seemed to fit, neither from the servants, nor the advisors, nor from the king himself. The revelation had spread like invisible smoke, and everyone breathed in the heavy air of guilt that could no longer be hidden. In the inner chamber, David remained on his knees, as he had since the confrontation. The cold floor seemed to want to swallow his soul, and even there, broken, he felt the weight of Nathan's words, like stones thrown from a sky that had until then favored him in everything. "The Lord has forgiven you, but the child will die." The prophet had said, his voice firm, without hesitation. Those words did not stop echoing. "The child will die. The child, not the father, not the mother, but the child." On the opposite side of the palace, Bathsheba remained locked away. She did not cry out loud. Her tears were not like those of women who lose husbands in battle. They were silent, thick tears that flowed without a sound. She cried like a woman who feels the life within her womb fading before its time. She already felt her body different. The baby, so active days before, was now restlessly quiet. Every subtle movement felt more fragile. Every heartbeat that touched her abdomen with her palm seemed distant. "Mom," said the maid, with tearful eyes, "the king is fasting. He threw himself to the ground and doesn't want to eat. He says that perhaps the Lord will have mercy." Bathsheba did not respond. She was sitting next to the bed, her hands pressing against her belly, as if she wanted to hold the child with the strength of her own body. "But he doesn't understand," she murmured. "It's not just a judgment for him, it's my son. The baby never asked to be born, and now he would die without having asked to leave." David did not sleep. He spent the night kneeling, wrapped in sackcloth, with his face to the ground. He fasted, he prayed, he groaned words that could barely be heard. He asked God to spare him, to take the father but leave the son, to have mercy on the woman who was now in the palace but still lived like a prisoner of a scandal she did not cause. On the second day the fever began. Bathsheba noticed before the maids the abnormal heat on her skin, the subtle tremor in her hands, the altered breathing of the baby still in the womb. She ordered the midwives, the doctors, the men who knew about herbs, potions, and chants to be called. "Save my son," she said with fixed eyes. "Do whatever it takes." They came. They measured the pulse, examined the eyes, offered infusions. But nothing changed. The womb that carried promise now seemed to carry judgment. "The child is weak," one of the midwives said in a low voice, "but there is still time. Perhaps the Most High will change his mind," but God had already spoken. On the third day, the king continued his fast. He refused bread, water, rest. Kneeling in the stone courtyard under the burning sun, he prayed with the strength of one who no longer knew what more to offer. "Lord, spare him. Take me, but not him. I have sinned, he has not. I am the guilty one. He is innocent. For all that is holy, hear me." But the sky remained silent. In the women's quarters, Bathsheba no longer left her room. Her hands trembled, her face was pale. The room, once filled with light, now remained in shadows. The maidservants spoke only in whispers. The king was fasting and the queen was bleeding inside. On the fifth day, the baby was born. Premature, small, fragile. The midwife's cries were muffled by the tension in the room. "It's a boy," she announced. "He is alive, but the fever is high." Bathsheba stretched out her arms. She took the child carefully. He was so small, so light, so warm. His eyes did not open, but his chest rose and fell. He was there, alive. Even if only for a short time, she held him for hours. She cried softly. She sang childhood songs that her mother had taught her when she was still a girl. The other women in the court remained silent, respecting the pain of a mother who knew that time slipped away like sand through her fingers. On that same night, the king learned of the birth. But he did not get up. He remained on the ground. He kept asking, fasting, crying. "Perhaps God will still change his mind," he said. "Maybe he will see my remorse." But the sentence had already been given. On the seventh day, the crying stopped. The boy stopped breathing at dawn. No sound, no last gasp, just the stillness of the end. The women of the house covered the body with a white cloth. One of them rushed out to inform the king's servants. The men of the palace fell silent. They exchanged hesitant glances. "How will we tell him?" they whispered. "He's so shaken, he might do something crazy." But David noticed. "Is the child dead?" he asked without lifting his face. "Yes, my lord. He has died." The king sighed. Slowly, he got up from the ground. He washed his face. He changed his clothes, and to everyone's astonishment, he went to the temple and worshipped the Lord. When he returned to the palace, he asked for food. "While the boy was alive, I fasted," he explained. "I thought maybe the Lord will have mercy on me. But now that he is dead, why would I continue fasting? Can I bring him back?" And then, with eyes still moist, she murmured, "One day I will go to him, but he will not return to me." In the women's section, Bathsheba remained silent, sitting with her dead son in her arms. The sun had already risen when, at last, she relinquished him. Her hands did not want to let go. Her chest ached as if it were breaking. "Bury him quietly," she said. "Let no hymn be sung. Let no trumpet be blown. He was innocent." And there in that cold room, while the light timidly filtered through the cracks, Bathsheba understood. Her son was dead, and she would pay with her own blood for something she never chose. In the most protected room of the women's wing, surrounded by fine tapestries and covered windows, lay the royal baby. His chest rose and fell with effort, and each weak whimper was like a knife slowly burying itself in his mother's heart. Bathsheba was not sleeping. Sitting next to the crib, with sunken eyes and a pale face, she watched her son's irregular breathing. The maids took turns bringing cold towels, myrrh potions and herbal infusions, but nothing seemed to help. The baby burned inside. His little body trembled. His eyes opened only for brief moments, cloudy and confused. "He is getting worse," murmured one of the women, stepping away with a wet cloth in hand. "Bring Nathan. Bring whoever you want. Don't let him die," whispered Bathsheba, almost voiceless, but there was nothing to bring. God had already spoken. Upon learning of the illness, David abandoned everything. He took off his royal robes. He put on sackcloth. He threw himself on the temple floor, face to the ground, and there he remained. "Lord, do not take the boy. Take me instead," he cried with tears. "The child has done nothing. It is my fault. Spare him, O Most High. Spare the fruit of her womb." But there was no answer. For days the king did not eat. He did not rise. He did not speak to anyone. He refused water. He refused comfort. He only prayed. He prayed like a man who sees the gates of heaven closed and insists on knocking with his own knees. In the palace, agony was settling in. The baby's room, once full of promises, now smelled of death. The windows were covered to keep the temperature low. The midwives came and went with heavy eyes. The small body was beginning to shrink. The cries were less frequent. The eyes no longer responded to calls. "Madam, would you like to rest?" "A little," asked a servant holding a damp cloth. "Don't ask me that," Bathsheba replied in a cutting voice. "I did not sleep while Uriah marched, and I will not sleep while my son fights to live." She did not leave the room. She spoke to no one. She barely ate. Her face had lost its color. Her hands were always stretched over the crib, as if trying to protect the baby from an invisible storm. But the storm had already entered. "He is worse," one of the healers whispered. "Much worse." The words were always spoken in low voices, as if the air itself feared to offend the death that hovered over the crib. But for Bathsheba, no warning was needed. She saw, she felt. The world was crumbling once again, but now the crumbling was slow, perverse, cruel. In the distance, David remained prostrate. Lord, Lord of hosts, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, hear my prayer." His voice tore through the night like a lament without an answer. The priests watched from afar, unsure how to console. No psalm escaped his lips, only moans, tears, promises. But the promises of a man cannot erase the sentence of God. On the 6th day, the boy no longer cried. The room was stifling. The candles burned slowly. Bathsheba's face was a mask of expressionlessness. The servants did not dare to speak to her. She sang. She sang a lullaby that her mother had sung to her when she was a girl. Her voice trembled. Sometimes it faltered. But she sang nevertheless. "Sleep, my child, in the shadow of the Most High, he who dwells in the secret place of God." Tears flowed down her face, but she did not wipe them away. "You did not ask to come, and now they want to take you," she whispered. "I did not ask to be a mother this way. I just wanted to protect you." No one knew what to say, not even the eldest women of the court, not the healers, not the elders. Everyone saw that this child was more than a baby. He was the burden of a kingdom, the price of a sin, the symbol of a pain that no one dared to name. At midnight, the baby had a crisis. His small body arched, his breathing failed, his eyes opened. One last time, briefly, Bathsheba held him in her arms, pressing him against her chest. The midwives approached, but none could take him from the mother's arms. "He is still here," she said. "I can feel it." But the boy's eyes no longer responded. Bathsheba did not scream. She did not groan. She simply closed her eyes and swayed, her body as if cradling a life that was no longer there. She remained that way for hours. The sun began to rise. The light slowly touched the room, as if asking for permission to enter. The women exchanged glances. One hurried out to inform the servants. David, still on his knees, saw the messenger approach with red eyes. "Did he die?" the king asked without moving. "Yes, my lord, he died." David said nothing. He stood up slowly, washed his face, changed his clothes. He walked to the temple and prostrated himself before the altar. He stayed there in silence, long and deep. In the room, Bathsheba remained motionless. The baby had already been taken away, but her hands were still on her chest as if holding something invisible. "My lady, do you wish us to call the king?" She shook her head. "No. Call heaven, if there is still anyone there." The maidservants cried. The house fell silent, and even with all the prayers, the sky remained closed. The room was dark. The heavy curtains had been drawn since dawn. Outside, Jerusalem continued its course. Distant trumpets, footsteps in the palace corridors, whispers muffled by the stone walls. But there, in that small space where the cradle was empty, time had stopped. Bathsheba did not speak. From the moment the baby's eyes closed forever, she emitted no sound, no crying, no words, no moans. She sat on the floor, with her knees drawn up and her hands clasped on her lap, her eyes fixed on nothingness. The child, her son, her only son, had departed, and with him all that remained of her strength. The maidservants took turns in silence. They changed the blankets, they washed the floor, they put away the potions, but no one dared to speak to her. There was a veil over Bathsheba's face, not of mourning but of agony, an agony so profound that not even tears could penetrate. The small body had been discreetly taken away. covered in white cloth, anointed with oils, carried by gentle hands that knew that they were not merely mourning a child, but a judgment, a consequence, a sentence. And Bathsheba remained there. The silence around her was thick, but inside her, the scream was deafening. Why? She thought, but could not utter. Why does the just die and the guilty continue to breathe? Time passed without her noticing. She didn't know if it was morning, afternoon, or night. The only light came from a candle burning in the corner, casting trembling shadows on the walls. David learned of the death in the temple courtyard. He was there, still on his knees, when the messenger arrived. The servants were afraid to tell him, as they could see the state of the king, but he looked at them as if he already knew. "He is dead?" he asked without raising his voice. "Yes, my lord," replied the servant with his eyes downcast. "He is dead." David remained silent for a moment. Then he stood up, washed his face with cold water, changed his sackcloth for clean clothes, and went to the temple. There he prostrated himself and worshipped the Lord. His eyes were red, but his mouth no longer murmured prayers. It was as if he accepted the decree, even without understanding it. Upon returning to the palace, he passed through the inner chambers and headed to the women's quarters. He walked slowly, without sound. When he entered Bathsheba's room, he saw her there motionless like a living statue of pain. "Bathsheba," he called in a low voice. She did not respond. He approached, knelt by her side, touched her hands. "The boy is gone." She looked at him, and in that gaze there was a storm that couldn't be seen from the outside. No tears fell, but the pain was glaring. Her body trembled, slightly. Her hands were cold. "I know," she whispered finally. "I felt it when he stopped fighting." David swallowed hard. "The Lord took him for himself. I don't know God's ways, but he is just." Bathsheba let out an empty laugh, not one of mockery, but of exhaustion. "Just? He died for something he didn't do. I carried him. I nurtured him. And now he's gone. And I stayed. With everything." David didn't respond. He stayed beside her in silence. But she didn't want silence. For the first time, she struggled to stand up and screamed, not with her voice, but with her eyes, with her gestures, with her soul. "You stood up. You ate. You washed yourself. But what about me? How does a mother wash herself after her child dies for something she didn't choose?" The servants stepped back. There was something too sacred and painful in that room, a space where no one could enter, except for pain. She walked up to the empty crib. She ran her hand over the wood. She looked inside where there was nothing left, and then she let out a sound, not a scream, not a sob. It was something between a whisper and a thunder. "I will never be the same." David watched her. He wanted to approach, but she raised her hand. "Leave me here, at least today. Just today, let me fall apart in peace." The king nodded and withdrew. He closed the door carefully. Hours later, the candle in the corner went out. Darkness filled the room, and Bathsheba, lying on the floor with her eyes open, finally let the tears come. She cried. She cried like a mother who lost what she loved most. She cried like a woman whose body was used and whose soul was forgotten. She cried like someone who had been torn from her own story. And there, in that darkness, with no one around, without the baby in her arms, without strength for anything. More, she understood the name that the world never gave her, but which defined her soul, the hidden history of Bathsheba, the son who died for a sin. The days that followed the boy's death passed like a fog over Jerusalem. The palace remained silent, the festivities were cancelled, the windows stayed shut, and even the psalmists who once sang in the courtyards knew that, at that time, song would be a disrespect. Bathsheba, still wrapped in mourning clothes, rarely left her room. The cradle had been removed, the linen cloth stored away, the bathing herbs for the newborn discarded. Pain was now a quiet companion. It no longer screamed, but it was there, sitting in silence by her side, a permanent emptiness between the ribs. No one dared to mention the child's name, not even David. The king had returned to his duties, judging, writing psalms, leading councils. But something in his expression was heavier. It was as if the lines of his face carried the echo of what had been lost. One afternoon, when the sun was hiding behind the hills and the light tinged the walls a dark gold, David went to Bathsheba. He found her sitting on the floor of the room, hands in her lap, looking out the slightly opened window. "May I come in?" he asked in a low voice. She nodded without taking her eyes off the horizon. "The days are longer," she murmured, "but inside me, everything still seems dark." David approached slowly. He sat down beside her. "I know," he said. "Nothing will be as it was. But perhaps something will still bloom." She turned her face slowly. "After everything that happened, do you still expect flowers?" The king did not reply immediately. He extended his hand and gently held hers. "God is just, but he is also merciful. And sometimes, after a long night, he gives us a new day." Bathsheba's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not just from pain. There was something different, a small warmth, like a live ember buried beneath the ashes. A few weeks passed. Time, which had seemed to stand still, began to move again. Slowly, Bathsheba resumed her activities. She started walking in the gardens. She returned to sitting in the palace women's meetings. She reopened the chest with the linen garments. Life, in a nearly imperceptible way, was coming back. And then came the news that changed the course of sadness. She was pregnant. The first person to know was one of the oldest servants in the house. She saw the change in the queen's eyes, in the hands resting on her belly, in the contained sighs. "My lady, is it true?" she asked with hope. "Yes," replied Bathsheba, with a smile that carried more fear than joy. "But this time, I won't say anything to anyone. Not yet." She didn't want any fanfare, nor any premature blessings. The memory of the last loss still burned in her soul. Each new day of gestation was an act of silent faith. She prayed in secret. She touched her belly with reverence. And she waited. When David found out, a subtle shine crossed his eyes. He embraced her carefully. He didn't speak much, but in his eyes there was the plea of a man who desired redemption. "May the Lord grant us peace," he said. Months passed, and at the appointed time, amid murmurs of the court and the watchful gaze of the servant girls, Bathsheba gave birth to a son. The delivery was difficult, but different. There was strength in her body. There was hope contained in each contraction. And when the baby cried for the first time, the sound filled not just the room, but the corridors of the palace, the eyes of the women, and her heart. She held him in her arms and cried, "You came," she said, her voice trembling, "and you are alive." The servant smiled. The king entered the chamber, and upon seeing the son, bowed silently. "The Lord heard us," he said, "and he was merciful." Days later, David called the prophet Nathan. The same man who had announced the death of the first son was now called to present the new one to the presence of God. "His name will be Solomon," David declared, "because the Lord has granted us peace." Nathan nodded but smiled unexpectedly. "The Lord loves him," said the prophet, "and has commanded him to be called by another name, a name that no one else will bear." "What name?" asked Bathsheba, curious. "Jedediah," answered Nathan, "beloved of the Lord." Those words deeply touched Bathsheba's heart. It was as if the heavens, which had once taken away a son, were now returning another with an eternal seal of approval. But she knew, even divine promises carry with them the necessity of human vigilance. Looking at the baby in her arms, she did not see just a child. She saw a potential kingdom, an heir, a holy seed planted amidst mourning and regret. "I will protect him," she whispered, "with all that I have, with all that I am." And for the first time since the day she lost Uriah, Bathsheba felt that perhaps, just perhaps, she was being restored. But I knew that divine promises also require human vigilance. The years had passed like a breath from the desert, harsh, unpredictable, merciless. Bathsheba was now a mature woman. The hands that once held a dead baby now guided her living son through the halls of power. Solomon grew strong, intelligent, silent like his mother, but with his father's eyes. The palace was no longer a prison, it was a battleground. David had aged. The strength of the days of war had faded. His voice no longer echoed as it once did, and his eyes dimmed more quickly at the end of the afternoon. Rumors about his health spread like the wind among the columns of the palace. And with them, the vultures of succession began to circle the throne. Adonijah, son of Haggith, beautiful, ambitious, and fearless, was the first to move. "The kingdom needs leadership," he murmured to the nobles. "My father no longer rules, and I am the living firstborn." He began to act in secret. He gathered support among the commanders. He organized feasts. He had sacrifices made. He called priests, generals, and even part of the people. He dressed like a king. He behaved like a king. He presented himself as a king, and in silence, without consulting his father, Adonijah proclaimed himself king of Israel. The announcement spread like fire among the vines. Many celebrated, others feared. But in Bathsheba's chamber, the wind that arrived brought something far deadlier than betrayal. It brought the risk of losing everything once again. She heard from the servants. One of them arrived breathless, his eyes wide. "My lady, Adonijah, he declared himself king." Bathsheba remained motionless. "And David?" she asked in a cold voice. "Nothing, I was not informed. He is lying down, without strength." She remained silent for a moment, then she slowly stood up. Like a woman who has lost too much to allow fate to push her again. "Bring me Nathan," she ordered. The prophet arrived a short time later. He was older, with white hair, but his eyes still burned with the fire of truth. "Adonijah is acting in secret," he said. "If we don't do something now, the throne will be his. And when David is gone, you and your son will be the first to die." "I know," she replied. "I have seen what a kingdom can do to those who carry promises." So calmly, cunningly, courageously, she devised a plan. That very afternoon, while Adonijah celebrated his reign with meat, wine, and treacherous alliances, Bathsheba entered the king's chamber. David lay pale, wrapped in heavy robes, his eyes nearly closed. But when he heard her voice, he struggled to rise. "My lord," she began with reverence and firmness, "you swore to your servant by the Lord your God that Solomon would sit on your throne after you. You said it with your own mouth. But behold, Adonijah has become king, and you, O king, do not know it." David blinked, his eyes now open. His breath quickened. He wanted to speak, but he lacked strength. Bathsheba continued, "If this goes on, my son and I will be treated as traitors, as enemies of the kingdom. Lord, we cannot wait. Remember the promise. Remember the word of the Lord." She knelt down. And then, as planned, Nathan entered. "My king," said the prophet, "did you command that Adonijah reign after you? For he has celebrated, sacrificed, proclaimed before the people, and everyone believes that he is the new king." David closed his eyes, and there, with the voice that he still had left, he answered, "Bring me Zadok, Nathan, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. They will anoint Solomon king over Israel. He will ride my own mule, and he will be proclaimed before all the people." Today, right now, the announcement spread like thunder. Solomon was brought to Gihon. Zadok anointed him with holy oil. Nathan blessed him in the name of the Lord. The men of war accompanied him with songs, and when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, a cry rose from Jerusalem, "Long live King Solomon!" The city trembled, and at Adonijah's banquet, the wine froze in the cups. The guests looked at each other in panic. The party turned to silence. The glory became shame. Adonijah fled, and Bathsheba remained. That night, she walked alone through the palace corridors. She stopped in front of the throne room. The guards made way. She entered. She sat in the place reserved for the Queen Mother, and she cried. But this time it was not out of pain. It was out of survival. "Are you ready, my son?" she asked. Solomon, with tenderness and firmness, "I am, mother, but I need you." She smiled. "I will be here, not out of vanity, but because I fought for you to breathe this air." And that day, with tear-filled eyes before the throne, Bathsheba understood what no one had ever written justly. The hidden history of Bathsheba has become the visible memory of a woman who lost everything to save the future. Time had dressed Jerusalem in new hues. The walls, which once witnessed wars and proclamations, now held memories. The palace, still majestic, moved at a different pace. The halls were quieter, the corridors more serene. The throne, once contested with blood and fear, was now occupied with wisdom and peace. Solomon reigned, and beside him, sitting in an honor chair made of cedar from Lebanon, rested Bathsheba. Now older, with graying hair and eyes heavy with a history that almost no one dared to mention aloud. But Solomon honored her before all the people. Whenever the throne was mentioned, the Queen Mother was remembered, not as an ornament of the court, but as the woman who had secured God's promise. In those days of calm, Bathsheba spent long afternoons in the palace gardens. She listened to the psalmists sing, watched the servants tend to the flowers, and sometimes simply allowed the wind to blow between the veils, bringing to memory what the years could never erase. Her body was more frail, the hands marked, the walk slow, but within her there was peace. One morning, as the sun spread across the stone floor, Solomon came to her. "Mother," he said, smiling, "the people await your blessing at the entrance of the house of the Lord." She lifted her eyes. She saw in him not only the son she had borne with pain, but the man who had been shaped by the promise of God. "Today," she asked softly. Today, Solomon replied. I want you to see with your own eyes who the woman was that fought for this throne. She rose slowly. She dressed in white robes. She tied her hair, and before leaving she stood for a few moments in front of a mirror. The woman she saw there was no longer the young girl who bathed in the sun, nor the mother who cried over an empty cradle. She was a survivor. On the way to the temple, the guards bowed. The elders fell silent. The women smiled in respect. The children pointed and asked, "Who is she?" And the answer was always whispered, as if they were talking about a living legend. It is Bathsheba, the mother of the king. When she reached the steps of the Lord's house, Bathsheba lifted her eyes to the sky. The daylight enveloped her gently. She closed her eyes for a moment, and then she saw in her mind everything she had lived. The silent betrayal, the mourning for her husband, the silent scream for her dead son, the humiliation, the forgetfulness, and the miracle of the restored womb. She remembered Uriah, his face, his silence. She remembered the nameless boy who was hastily buried and never had a headstone. She remembered the night she sat alone in the dark, convinced that she had been forgotten by God. But she was not. God did not forget her. He did not speak when she was summoned to the palace. He did not intervene when her husband was betrayed. He did not prevent her son from dying. But he was there in everything, sustaining her in silence, shaping her in pain, preparing her to be not only the mother of a king, but the mother of a lineage that would carry redemption. Later that same day, sitting beside Solomon's throne, Bathsheba heard the people singing praises to God. And as she looked at her son, she saw that the promise had survived sin, scandal, shame. Because God does not write stories with human perfection, but with eternal mercy. She smiled. For the first time, a full smile, not out of nostalgia, nor relief, but out of gratitude. The court looked at her with honor, the women with respect, and Solomon with love. She knew. Her name had been cleared, her story restored, her pain finally understood. And then, before the day ended, before the torches were lit and the trumpets fell silent, she said to one of the young women who accompanied her, "Write this down, daughter, so that one day they will know. I was not forgotten, I was not despised. Even when no one defended me, God wrote my story with redemption." If you were touched by this story, 2 other videos featuring biblical characters equally marked by God's grace will now appear on your screen. Click to watch, subscribe to the channel, and leave your like. May the Lord speak to you, even in the darkest silence of your desert.